Hello everyone. I'm going to start my Q&Q, and I'm going to start off with the Cheryl I. Harris reading from the Critical Race Theory, Key Writings That Form the Movement. And the quote that I'm going to be drawing from is on page 290, on the left-hand column towards the bottom of the page. So the South African conception of affirmative action expands the application of affirmative action to a much broader domain than has typically been envisioned in the United States. That is, South Africans consider affirmative action a strategic measure to address directly the distribution of property and power, with particular regard to the maldistribution of land and the need for housing. This policy has not yet been clearly defined, but what is implied by this conception of affirmative action is that existing distributions of property will be modified by rectifying unjust loss and inequality. Property rights will then be respected, but they will not be absolute. Rather, they will be considered against a societal requirement of affirmative action. So one of the major takeaways, like it kind of seemed that the reading came into focus whenever I had something to compare um, the affirmative action policies in the United States with of a similar like apartheid state. And so the big thing is whiteness as property. That's like what we're considering. So like how does whiteness like translate into property rights, and like how is whiteness in and of itself property, right? And so I think it's very interesting that a country that kind of had its like civil rights movement at a later date and post Cold War is able to kind of understand and see some of the like malformations of the United States' like affirmative action policies as well as their own, right? And so then this kind of system, like it makes sense because like as the civil rights movement like affected change or didn't affect change, there were like a lot of questions about how distribution and like what kinds of like reparations were going to be prepared or not prepared or given or not given, right? And so then for me, it's kind of interesting to see how the conversation and the dialogue between these two countries is like it's not really spoken about as much or as clearly as it often I feel could be, because like there isn't much space given to South Africa in like a typical history class, right? So being socially aware, being conscious, I guess, to some extent, like it is a country that is like talked about, particularly in contemporary society, but that hasn't always necessarily been the case, right? And I just, I don't know, like the reading was pretty interesting in how it shapes whiteness as property, but it was also very interesting to see the kind of contrasting ways that affirmative action is understood between like countries, right? And as South Africa kind of broke its apartheid after watching how the civil rights movement has played out in the United States, it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be a differing understanding, at least how the laws are presented. Um, yeah, so that's kind of what's going on there. I'm going to move on to the critical race theory, the cutting edge, third edition. I'm going to kind of go kind of how the book provides the structuring. So I'm going to start off with the Derek Bell piece, um, which is also kind of talking about property rights and whiteness. And so I'm going to kind of pull from two different sections, two different quotes, but they're pretty small, and I think they kind of speak to each other, and they're pretty close on the page. So I'm on page 66 and 67, reading Derek Bell's Property Rights in Whiteness. So the first quote is that the economic benefits of slavery and the political compromises of black rights played a very major role in the nation's growth and development, and surely so. In short, without slavery, there would be no constitution to celebrate. This is true not only because slavery provided wealth that made independence possible, but also because it afforded an ideological basis to resolve conflict between propertied and unpropertied whites. And then on the next page, right at the top, Thus, paradoxically, slavery for blacks led to greater freedom for poor whites, at least when compared with the denial of freedom of African slaves. Slavery also provided many property-less whites with a property in their whiteness. So I think what Derek Bell is trying to get at here is that as identity becomes a property in and of itself, we see that becoming kind of like a placeholder for land and like the ability to be self-sustaining, right? Because like the thing that historically we know is that like poor whites really don't necessarily benefit from the capitalistic system either, right? But now they have a claim to a type of property that blacks or like African slaves don't, right? And so it's like just really highlighting the difference between how whiteness becomes a property, but blackness has always been property, but these properties are functioning on two different levels. Whiteness as property becomes white privilege, right? As if we were to follow like the logic of this reading. And I would agree with that. But here, instead of having a human identity, slaves are seen as only property. So it's not like a piece of your identity becomes property, as is the case that Bell is arguing about whiteness. Rather, it's just kind of putting into perspective that as whiteness becomes a tangible, understandable idea, it also becomes a property in a fashion. So I think that this piece is really, really interesting because it kind of gets at like one of the bigger arguments that like a lot of white folks in particular kind of take up as like this Civil War only being fought or being fought for things other than slavery, right? And sure, you could make that argument that it was fought that for states' rights, but then what were the rights of the state that they were fighting for, right? Like it's slavery. So there really isn't much a debate that the overarching theme is slavery, right? And so we can like split the hairs, we can cut the fat however we want to, but Derek Bell is specifically asking us to look at the very formation of the country and the fact that since slavery was not like addressed in an effective way, essentially like disbanding slavery with the original Constitution, it thus set up a system that both granted the country's ability to be independent, but it also pretty much just put off a delay, like made a delay for the resolution of like black people's property, right? Because it's not an ethical question, it's a capitalistic question, it's a moneyed question, it's a mercantilism question, right? Given the time frame. And that in and of itself is just like it seems unbelievable like today that like people are only seen as property for basically only economic gain. But like when I really think about it, that's really not so different than like wage slavery, right? Like it's not so different than other structures and formations of power that are still in play today that directly impact how we understand our relationship and orientation to like the properties we do have and the freedoms we have or the freedoms that we don't have, right? And so I found this reading particularly interesting just because it's kind of like ammo, right? Like in some ways, this reading breaks down the Civil War and it breaks down the whole process of poor whites understanding themselves in relation to rich whites, even though there's no real chance of social mobility in the way that rich whites kind of set the system up for like poor white folks to believe. And then it becomes like even more kind of like ludicrous and yeah, I don't really have a different word for it. The fact that the only thing that kind of like brought these folks together was the fact that they were able to subjugate a different group of complete humans. Like it's just like what's going on there? Why? Beyond like capitalism, beyond the fact that like sure slavery allowed the union to form, and I guess that's a good thing. I don't know. Some days it feels good, most days it doesn't. Um, I do think that there's a lot to be thought about there because it is kind of ammo for our current political times and current political climate. So we're gonna move on, so I don't take up too much time here, and I'm gonna read a quote from Ian F. Haney Lopez, and this quote can be found towards the top of page 778. The article is White by Law. Um, and so this piece is kind of talking about how different laws come into play in defining whiteness. And the piece that I'm kind of hitting is the contrast between scientific knowledge and common knowledge. So the early prerequisite courts assumed that common knowledge and scientific evidence both measured the same thing, that the natural physical differences that marked humankind into disparate disparate races. Any difference between the two would be found in levels of exactitude in terms of how accurately these existing differences were measured, and not in substantive disagreements about the nature of racial difference itself. This position seemed tenable so long as science and the popular beliefs jibed in the construction of the racial categories. So here we see like the ineffective system kind of set up by like the courts and just a big like a huge assumption that doesn't actually get at racial difference in and of itself. It's just more focusing on how do we define white and only white, right? So it's not going beyond like a binary of white and then everyone else. So it's like even further than we read last week in the white black binary, right? Like it's drawing into contrast white and everyone else as deemed by the courts, right? The system that's supposed to measure out justice, the system that's supposed to be representative of our country. But here we don't see that. We only see the system as it still does, really only representing white folks, right? The fact that the courts would be the ones who decided whether or not someone was white or not seems kind of ridiculous to me. Like, I don't see how a court could make that call or why a court should ever have to make that call. However, the article brings to light a lot of things that like I wasn't necessarily aware of, or at least not in like as great a detail, in understanding what were the motivations of defining white, right? This article in particular contrasts white and who gets to be included as white in like different immigration like groups. So like we see that some some Asians and particularly dark-skinned Asians like Asian Indians were never considered Caucasian, right? So it's using that label, that etymology. Um, but then we also have folks kind of um, like the Near East being considered white with like the oh, well, it's not really that important. There's just a couple examples that were essentially based off of genocide, and so it kind of opens up the possibility for whiteness. And I kind of wonder how that plays into the politics of being assigned whiteness. Um, but I think that it's really kind of interesting that as we read on, there's another quote that kind of illuminates what Lopez is kind of arguing for. And so on page 779, right underneath the title White Race Consciousness, as a category, white was constructed by the prerequisite courts in a two-step process that ultimately defined not just the boundaries of that group, but its identity as well. First, note that the courts constructed the bounds of whiteness by deciding on a case-by-case basis who was not white. Though the prerequisite courts were charged with defining the term white person, they did so not through an appeal to a freestanding notion of whiteness, but instead negatively by identifying who is non-white. So that's kind of what I've been hitting more or less. And the article breaks down a couple different Kate courses to Yup and Thind to kind of highlight how like we see different types of racism play out in the court system, whether it be from like Asian Indians or Chinese folks, right? And the process through which those individual groups were decided on a case by case basis. And I think that it's awfully interesting that one of the biggest things I've kind of taken away from this class is the conversation of like the judicial structures against Chinese folks. Like I wasn't like I mean yeah I knew about Japanese internment. I knew that during the railroad period that there were such laws, but how long that they stood up in court was something that I didn't know. And that's kind of what I took away more from this piece than anything else is that as late as like 1909, um, we kind of see court cases that are still defining who is not white, right? And this kind of like situation continues on because there's references like as late as the 1930s of like how these systems are still enacted, whether or not the laws are the ones that are doing the enactment of these situations. And so for me, I'm kind of just like, how did the system last this long, right? Is it kind of as we've read in Derek Bell and the previous reading? Like, is it based on this property of whiteness? Is that kind of the motivation? I'm not really sure, you know. That's one of the things I've kind of struggled with these readings in particular is understanding how the court functions within this system. Um, because like you have like different layers, you have different hierarchies, and arguably the court is like representative of one of the highest hierarchies, right? But at the same time, not every person is always like going to be in court. Not every case is going to make it to the Supreme Court. And if the case does make it to the Supreme Court, it's kind of up in the air, right? And like that's one of the things that like is kind of consistent throughout all of these readings is that the ruling could go either way, right? And more often than not, it favored in defining not white rather than focusing on defining white. It's like a problematic system no matter what. If you define white, then you're still keeping folks out of a particular system. But when you only define something and it's negative, right? So what it is not, there's so much more latitude there of what like could constitute the in group and the out group. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. So moving on to the Thomas Ross, the quote that I'm choosing here is solely just like as a rhetorician. Like this piece came out of the gate super hard for me, and it really got me into the piece. And so while I don't necessarily understand everything that's happening here within the Thomas Ross piece about innocence and affirmative action, I do have enough context because of the article itself to at least follow the argument. But Ross opens with, on page 783, when we create arguments, we reveal ourselves by the words and ideas we choose to employ. Verbal structures that are used widely and persistently are especially worth examination. Arguments made with repeated, almost formulaic sets of words suggest a second argument falling beneath the apparent argument. Beneath the apparently abstract language and syllogistic form of these arguments, we may discover the deeper currents that explain, at least in part, why we seem so attached to these verbal structures, right? So this is essentially like, for me, this is kind of taking a very rhetorical approach to understanding the different layers of argument, right? There's the performative, there's the actual things we say, then there's also the subtext. And this entire piece seems to be focusing on the subtext, right? So how affirmative get action is mobilized to kind of shape white identity as well. So it's presented as like this program to provide equal opportunities, I guess. But one of the consistent things that we've read throughout the semester is the way that these supposedly anti-discrimination laws are used to actually reinforce discrimination. So when we read about folks being angry because they didn't get into a college and then blaming affirmative action programs, we're actually seeing the embodiment of the white innocence that Ross is talking about, but we're also seeing the embodiment of furthered and continued racism. So like there's like this tension. The undercurrent is the like enactment of a unspoken racial bias, right? And so then that's kind of what drew me into this piece is the fact that like it's all based on how words construct knowledge how the interaction of words then allows these subtexts to be able to function and flow. So we're going to move on from there because I know this is running pretty long and we still got two more quotes to talk about. But we're going to move on to the Stephanie M. Wildman piece and Adrian D. Davis, Language and Silence, making systems of privilege visible. So the quote that I'm drawing from here is about a quarter down on 795. And this is also in line with the previous reading. I was just kind of in that mindset. So the quote is, the very vocabulary that we use to talk about discrimination obscures these power systems and the privilege that is their natural companion. To remedy discrimination effectively, we must make the power systems and privileges that they create visible and part of discourse. So this is our problem with talking about race, sex, sexual orientation. Each needs to be described as a power system that creates privilege in some and disadvantages in others. Most civil rights writing and advocacy focus on the disadvantage of discrimination, ignoring the element of privilege. To really talk about these issues, privilege must be made visible, right? And so this is kind of one of the underlying themes of a lot of like critical whiteness studies is essentially making that privilege visible, right? But what's really interesting to me here is the fact that this is kind of hitting the actual like language component, the method of communication that we like as humans use to express knowledge and exchange ideas, right? And it's kind of talking about how it has to be a whole system. The entire system has to be apparent and visible in order for this like actual conversation about race, sex, and sexual orientation, among many other things, right? To be able to even to happen, right? Like you could add in there like class privilege, you could add in there a lot of other things that are privileged, but in kind of like the similar case of where we see the courts defining what is not white, we only see like the authors are claiming we only see a conversation about the discrimination itself. And so then part of the system is missing from that conversation because it's not incorporating how privilege plays into that, right? And so I think that's really, really interesting because that is like the necessary move. Like it makes logical sense that for folks to really be able to investigate and interrogate their own positionalities and their own things that are just naturally privileged by society, or like I guess not naturally, but like socially privileged by society, and to be able to really engage with that, right? And for like a lot of folks, this is like a really, really hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of practice in order to develop the willingness to engage in that kind of conversation. But this is one of the first readings where I've seen like authors explicitly state that like it's no matter how uncomfortable it is, the systems of oppression that exist will never be dismantled until we're able to have that conversation. So comfort is not important in the same ways as the conversation about race discrimination and the systems that enforce that, whether it be on like sex or sexual orientation, you know? And so actually getting at the language we use and breaking down and showing like, well, like here's how we adjust the system, or here's how we fulfill the network, is by also including the other features that allow privilege to function. That's kind of like revelatory to me, at least, because it kind of bugs me. It begs the question of like, how do I enact that? How do I talk about my own privilege? How do I understand my own embodiment in the body I'm in, and how that relates to social structures and social oppressions, right? Like, and how can I engage with folks to be able to talk about these things, but then not ask them to bear my emotional burden? Because like that's also what's underlying throughout this article, is that like as we start to talk about privilege, there is a certain hedging against asking someone else to bear the emotional burden of talking about privilege, right? So moving on to the last reading, I know this is kind of a whirlwind, but again, yeah, it's a video response and I don't want to keep you listening too long or watching too long. So we're moving on to Richard Delgado's Rodrigo's Portent. And this is a larger quote. I kind of honestly I struggled to find a specific quote for this because it is essentially a narrative. Um, and the whole thing like is very, very interesting, and it kind of is within the realm of like what I'm particularly interested in studying right now. And so I went from 2 pages that I was just going to read out loud because it's a conversation and it flows really quickly, but then kind of broke that down a little bit. So I'm reading the last sentence more, the last 2 sentences more or less on 8:10 onto 8:11. So I added, a lot of the media are centered in New York and other cities, and I doubt that they are any freer of the stereotypes you mentioned. So I'm not sure you can lay out all of the blame on California and its discontents. Besides, white folks have more money and connections than our brothers and sisters of color, and by and large, better educations. Wouldn't you need to show the disparities in broadcasters, writers, and show that the disparities in broadcasters, writers, and editors have increased in recent years as the minority population has grown? Shouldn't you be looking at things from a historical perspective? I've started doing that, and as luck would have it, a recent book and article collect much of this material. Rodrigo helped with a thick book, held up a thick book and with a blue and gold cover. I squinted and asked, "Who's it by?" Two California academics, Walton Bean and James Rawls, titled "California: An Interpretive History." It just came out in a new edition by Rawls. It's a good read. It begins by revising the state's early history, including settlements, conquests, and early farm um, fascism in the 1930s, Indian massacres and relocation, and unspeakable brutality towards blacks, Chinese, and Asians. It discusses the rise of the great corporations, the railroads, the agribusiness. The last few chapters on the modern era were particularly helpful. Uh, do the authors describe the state in neocolonial terms? I asked. No, although they are scathing about the state's treatment of Indians, women, and minorities. But if you read carefully, you begin to see the outlines of a colonial society coming into focus, especially in the closing chapters. So even though the authors don't apply the term to recent developments, they do in all but name. Um, for me, neocolonialism has been a very hard thing to kind of be able to define and understand. And one of the things I think that this piece by Delgado is doing is it's kind of showing how neocolonialism functions. In some ways, it's kind of making the same move and not necessarily defining neocolonialism, but rather is pointing towards neocolonial acts, right, and neocolonial systems, right? So we have examples of what neocolonialism is and how it functions and what it does in the state of California. But those examples don't necessarily apply to every state across like our country, right? But the concepts, like the focus on the corporations, the agribusiness, the social and racial prejudice against people of color, and how like capitalism functions within that larger entity is something that is very clearly defined and can be traced in more states than not in this country in particular. I really find conversations of neocolonialism some of the hardest to have with like fellow white academics, for like lack of a better phrase, because pretty much no matter how like socially aware or conscious they are, it is kind of a hard thing to discuss because it implies a certain complacency within a larger system. Like we all have computers, we all have like all of these technological devices that are made under shady conditions. The components themselves are like essentially raping the earth, right? You know, we're ripping all these materials out of the earth to build these computers, and then we're like these computers are built typically by like folks who are in factories not allowed to leave, right? Like there's a lot of controversy around that in terms of globalization. One of the things that I think this piece does is it looks at a local case that can then be brought to the larger picture, right? And the focus is never off of how neocolonialism functions, right? And that's really, really important because it's a slippery term. It can be understood in different ways, right? And without some tactile examples, which have been frankly kind of hard to come by through my research. Like there is a lot of conversation about what neocolonialism is, but not necessarily like here's an example of neocolonialism. Um, and so like that's kind of what drew me to the Delgado piece, is just like being able to be like, okay, so now I have a text that I can refer folks to, if they're like, if they don't necessarily understand how neocolonialism functions. There's still an additional conversation about what neocolonialism is, and it's something that I think this piece is like starting to get at, because like even like it's ever evolving, right? So like as globalization happens on larger and larger scales, how neocolonialism is understood is also changing, and how it functions is also changing, right? When we have multinational corporations essentially invoking colonial projects in order to allow themselves to maintain and continue, like as we see with like the Dakota Access Pipeline, we also then like have to question like how these systems are actually drawing on previous like colonial acts in the first place, like how these systems are essentially calling these moves different things, but they're the same moves that have been happening for centuries, right? And I think that that's like probably the most important thing here, is that there is never a reprieve from colonialism. And like that's what this like article is showing me, is that colonialism is always functioning, and it always will function until the systems that allow colonialism to function are broken themselves. Um, and I get like how that's kind of like a fire and brimstone, I guess, like way to approach understanding colonialism, but at the same time, this like the system is unsustainable, so then like the system has to break eventually in order for like a new system to be built. And like what that process looks like is like, that's like what I'm really really wanting to know, right? um yeah. And like that's just like kind of like what I'm like hoping to be able to develop, at least to some extent in my own scholarship, is like understanding how to engage white folks in understanding colonialism as a project, and then how to change that system. I don't know if I'll be effective. I probably won't be effective. But at the end of the day, I kind of feel like there's a reason to do the work sometimes that's more important than whether or not it'll succeed. Because like it's can't just be me, and that's kind of what decolonial theory like points us towards, is that it can't be any one person. So I guess like my question for these readings is that we see whiteness become a property. We see whiteness essentially being commodified, in a different way that becomes power than any other racial group. And so I guess my question for these, like from these readings, would be, can we understand this process of commodifying whiteness into power as a neo-colonial act? And if so, how then do we address that? Like, how do we address the privileges property in a larger system that is attempting to break down neocolonialism? If we can't consider the commodification of whiteness as power in relation to neocolonialism, then what's preventing that? Or where's the disconnect, right? It's kind of a huge question. It's kind of a large question, and honestly, it didn't really come into focus for me until I read the Delgado piece, and I found myself wanting to quote pages and pages instead of just a smaller section. Um, but I think that even though it is a huge question that is kind of like it could be answered in many many ways based on like subject position and experience, there is some commonalities through the question that I think can be looked at, can be understood, can be addressed. And so, yeah, thank you for listening. I know this is way long, and I apologize. I'll try to make my next video response shorter. Sorry.